The studio was silent. Millions of Americans sat glued to their screens, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. The host, Meredith Hale, one of the most controversial and openly biased TV personalities in the country, had just spewed a comment so vile, so blatantly racist, that the audience gasped in shock. But it was the man sitting across from her, the man she had tried to belittle on live television, who stole the moment. Jamal Carrington, billionaire entrepreneur, real estate mogul, and one of the wealthiest black men in America, leaned forward with an icy calmness in his eyes. He had been underestimated his whole life. He had been insulted, ignored, doubted. But this was different. Meredith smirked, thinking she had won. The way she twisted the narrative, the way she crafted her questions, she thought she had him cornered. But what she didn't expect was Jamal's response. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. Instead, he said something so powerful, so devastating, that the entire studio fell into complete, unbearable silence. And then, Meredith's face changed. Her smirk disappeared. Her breath caught. For the first time in her career, she was speechless. She stared at him as if she had just seen a ghost. Then, with trembling hands, she reached for her earpiece, as if trying to confirm with her producers if this was really happening. Because in that moment, everything changed. 3 weeks earlier, the night was quiet in Jamal Carrington's penthouse overlooking Manhattan. He sat in his office, sipping a glass of water as he scrolled through his emails. Business was booming. His latest real estate development had just sold out within hours, and Forbes had published an article ranking him among the top black entrepreneurs in history. Then, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something told him to pick up. "Hello," he answered. A woman's voice came through, smooth yet laced with something sinister. "Mr. Carrington, this is Meredith Hale. I'd love to have you on my show." Jamal leaned back, raising an eyebrow. He knew exactly who she was. Meredith was notorious for her divisive, race-baiting tactics. She was known for ambushing black guests, twisting their words, and humiliating them on live TV. "Not interested," he said, about to hang up. "Oh, come on now," she pressed. "The American people deserve to hear your story. Don't you want to inspire young entrepreneurs?" Jamal chuckled. "You don't want my story. You want a spectacle." There was a pause. And then, she said something that made his grip tighten on the phone. "You don't have the guts to face me, do you?" His jaw clenched. He knew what she was doing, baiting him. And for a second, he considered walking away. But then he thought about all the young black kids watching. He thought about how, for years, people like Meredith had controlled the narrative, making black success seem like an anomaly, something to be doubted, questioned, even ridiculed. "Fine," he thought. "Let's play." "You want me on your show?" he said, his voice calm but firm. "Fine. I'll be there." The moment he hung up, he knew this was going to be war. The day of the interview arrived. Jamal stepped into the studio, his confidence radiating through his sharp navy blue suit. Cameras, producers, and assistants scurried around, making final adjustments. The audience was packed. Some were his supporters, but most? They were Meredith's. She thrived off controversy. She thrived off moments where she could trap someone, make them slip, and turn it into a viral moment. Jamal wouldn't be one of them. As he sat in the chair across from her, he could see it in her eyes. She thought she had already won. The cameras rolled. The show began. At first, the questions were standard. How did you rise to wealth? What inspired you? But then, slowly, she began to shift. Her tone became sharper. Her questions became pointed. "You know," she said, tapping a pin against the table, "there's a lot of talk about how people like you, people from, let's say, disadvantaged backgrounds, tend to get handouts." Jamal smirked. "Handouts?" She nodded. "Well, yes. Government programs, diversity initiatives. There are many who argue that black entrepreneurs often receive special treatment." Jamal chuckled. "That's funny. Because I don't remember the government handing me anything when I was living in my car." The audience murmured. Meredith wasn't done. She flipped a page in her notes. "But surely, you must admit, there's a reason why black communities struggle economically. Some say it's cultural. A lack of discipline, perhaps? The murmur turned into gasps. Jamal's expression didn't change. He simply tilted his head. A lack of discipline? Meredith shrugged. I mean, look at the statistics. Jamal leaned forward. And then, he spoke. The words that left his mouth were sharp as a blade, cutting through every racist stereotype she had just thrown at him. He spoke about history, about redlining, about discriminatory loan practices, about how black entrepreneurs were denied the same resources their white counterparts received for decades. He spoke about resilience, how, despite everything, black communities continued to rise, build, and create wealth, even when the system worked against them. He spoke about facts, cold, undeniable facts that Meredith couldn't twist or manipulate. And when he was done, the studio fell into silence. Meredith's face was pale. Then, something unexpected happened. Meredith Hale, the same woman who had built her entire career on race-baiting and twisting narratives, slowly removed her microphone. The audience held its breath. And then, in a voice so quiet yet so filled with something no one had ever heard from her before, she whispered, "I was wrong." Jamal blinked. The entire country, watching from their homes, gasped in shock. The queen of controversy, the woman who never backed down, had just admitted she was wrong. And then, the screen cut to commercial. The screen faded to black. Across America, millions of viewers sat frozen, their minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Meredith Hale, the ruthless, unshakable, racially divisive TV host, had just uttered 3 words no one ever thought would come from her lips. I was wrong. Producers in the control room panicked. This wasn't in the script. Meredith was supposed to dominate the debate, twist Jamal's words, and walk away victorious like she always did. Instead, she had gone completely off course, leaving the entire production team scrambling. Inside the studio, the silence was suffocating. The audience members were wide-eyed, many of them whispering among themselves, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Meredith sat stiffly, gripping the edges of her desk as if trying to hold onto reality itself. She looked at Jamal, her mouth slightly open, as if she wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Then, without another word, she ripped off her microphone, stood up, and walked off set. The audience gasped. The cameraman hesitated, unsure whether to follow her or stay focused on Jamal. The producers, stunned, fumbled through their earpieces, whispering urgent commands. And Jamal? He just sat there, watching her leave with an unreadable expression. Then, the camera cut to a commercial. Backstage was chaos. Meredith stormed through the hallway, her heels clicking violently against the marble floor. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. She ignored the frantic producers running after her, ignored the assistants whispering in hushed voices. She pushed open the door to her private dressing room and slammed it shut. Then, she locked it. Her chest rose and fell in rapid breaths. She stared at herself in the mirror. For the first time in her life, she didn't recognize the woman looking back at her. Meredith Hale had built her empire on controversy, on always being the smartest, sharpest, and most ruthless person in the room. She had torn people apart on live television, humiliated them, made them look weak. But today, she had been the one left speechless. And worse, she had felt something she had never felt before. Guilt. The truth in Jamal's words still rang in her head, like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. For years, she had dismissed conversations about race. She had laughed off discussions about systemic oppression. She had labeled people like Jamal as excuse-makers, believing that racism in America was nothing more than a crutch for the weak. But when he spoke, it wasn't weakness. It wasn't excuses. It was truth. Undeniable, irrefutable truth. And it shook her to her core. Her hands trembled as she grabbed a glass of water from the table. She took a sip, but nearly dropped the glass when she heard a knock on the door. She turned sharply. Meredith? It was her producer, Greg. What the hell was that? You just walked off live TV. She didn't respond. Meredith, open the damn door, he barked. Do you realize what you just did? We're trending across the country. The network wants answers. She still didn't move. Greg pounded again. If you don't fix this, your career is over. Her eyes darted back to the mirror. She should have felt fear, should have panicked, but instead, she felt something else. For the first time in her career, she felt free. Meanwhile, in the studio, Jamal sat calmly as producers whispered around him. "You did it," his assistant, Tyler, whispered beside him. "She broke." Jamal exhaled. He had expected a fight, expected her to argue, twist his words, and double down like she always did. But instead, she had cracked. For years, he had watched people like her dominate the media, spinning narratives that kept Black success under a cloud of doubt. And for years, he had played the game, staying quiet, keeping his head down, letting them say what they wanted. Not anymore. He had spoken, and the world had listened. A young woman, one of the production assistants, walked up nervously. "Mr. Carrington? The network executives want to speak with you. They're trying to figure out what happens next." Jamal nodded. "Tell them I'll talk after the show is officially over." The assistant nodded and scurried away. Tyler leaned in. "So what's the move, boss?" Jamal folded his hands. "We wait. Because right now, the world was on fire. News headlines were already flooding the internet. Meredith Hale walks OFF live TV after clashing with Black billionaire Jamal Carrington. Meredith Hale says, "I was wrong. Career suicide or change of heart?" Jamal Carrington leaves racist host speechless in televised showdown. And the biggest question on everyone's mind? Would Meredith Hale return? Or was this the end of her empire? 2 hours later, Meredith still hadn't left her dressing room. She had spent the last hour pacing, replaying every second of the interview in her head. Every time she tried to justify what she had said, the weight of Jamal's words crushed her again. Then, her phone rang. She hesitated before answering. "Meredith?" It was Greg again, but this time, his voice was calmer. "You need to come out. The network is giving you one chance to explain yourself before they make any decisions. They want a public statement." She swallowed hard. This was it. She could go out there and do what she had always done. Twist the narrative, make herself the victim, play the media game. Or, she could do something no one expected. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and whispered to herself, "What do I really believe?" Then, she made her decision. She unlocked the door and stepped out. Greg blinked in surprise. "Are you ready?" She nodded. "Good. They've already called a press conference. You go out there, you fix this, and you—" "I'm not fixing anything," she interrupted. Greg frowned. "What?" She looked him dead in the eye. "I'm telling the truth." Greg's mouth opened, then closed. He stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "Meredith, this isn't a joke. If you say the wrong thing—" "I've been saying the wrong thing for years," she cut in. Then, before he could argue, she turned and walked towards the cameras, towards the microphones, towards the biggest moment of her life. And as the world watched, waiting for Meredith Hale to do what she always did, she shocked them all. The press room was packed. Reporters, photographers, and camera crews filled every inch of the space, their lenses aimed squarely at the empty podium. The air buzzed with anticipation. Nobody knew what to expect. This wasn't just another news conference. This was Meredith Hale facing the world after the most shocking moment in television history. Just hours earlier, the woman known for her unshakable confidence and razor-sharp tongue had walked off live TV after whispering, "I was wrong," to Jamal Carrington, a man she had intended to humiliate. Now, everyone wanted to know, was this damage control? Was she going to apologize? Or was this the end of her career? A murmur ran through the room as the doors at the back opened. Meredith Hale stepped inside. For the first time in her career, she didn't look like the Meredith Hale the world knew. No perfect smirk, no carefully crafted arrogance. She looked human. Her blonde hair, always styled to perfection, was slightly tousled. She had removed her usual bright red lipstick. There was no expensive designer suit, just a simple, dark blue blazer over a plain white blouse. She approached the podium slowly. The cameras clicked. She exhaled. Then, she spoke. "I have spent my entire career believing I was right about everything." The room fell dead silent. "I believed that racism was overblown. I believed that Black success stories were proof that systemic racism was an excuse. And for years, I sat behind a desk, looking into a camera, and told millions of Americans the same thing. She paused, gripping the edges of the podium. But yesterday, I listened. The murmurs began again, low whispers of disbelief. Jamal Carrington didn't come onto my show to be my enemy. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get angry. He just told the truth. And the truth is, I was wrong. Gasps. The reporters were frozen, their pens hovering over notepads, their fingers resting on keyboards, as if they couldn't process what they were hearing. I was wrong, Meredith repeated, her voice steady. I built a career by twisting reality, by creating controversy where there was none. And in doing so, I hurt people. I hurt an entire community. She swallowed hard. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect sympathy. But I will not sit here and pretend anymore. This isn't about PR. This isn't about ratings. This is about truth. And I have spent too long avoiding it. The room erupted. Dozens of reporters shouted questions at once. Are you stepping down? Is this just a stunt? Do you regret everything you've said in your career? What does this mean for your show? Meredith held up a hand. I don't know what happens next, she admitted. Maybe I lose everything. Maybe I deserve to. But I will not go back to being the person I was yesterday. The press conference was over. She turned and walked away, leaving behind a stunned audience, an imploding news network, and an America that had just witnessed the impossible. Meanwhile, Jamal Carrington sat in his penthouse, watching it unfold on his television. Tyler, his assistant, let out a low whistle. Damn, she actually said it. Jamal didn't respond. He simply stared at the screen, his mind working through the implications. Meredith Hale wasn't just a TV host. She was a symbol, a figurehead of an entire media empire that thrived on division. And she had just set fire to it, on national television. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I need to talk. M. Hale. Jamal exhaled, rubbing his chin. Tyler peeked over his shoulder. You gonna answer? Jamal thought about it. Then, he picked up his phone and typed 2 words. Let's talk. Hours later, a black SUV pulled up in front of a private restaurant. Meredith stepped out, glancing around nervously. The streets were quiet, but she knew the entire world was watching. She had just done the unthinkable, publicly admitting she had been wrong. The backlash had already started. Social media was on fire. Half the country called her a traitor. The other half didn't trust her transformation. And then there was Jamal. She had expected him to ignore her message. But instead, he had agreed to meet. She entered the restaurant. Jamal was already there, seated at a private booth in the back. He didn't stand when she approached. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. She took a deep breath and slid into the seat across from him. Silence. Then, I'm not here to play games, Jamal said, his voice cool. Why did you really call me? Meredith swallowed. Because, she admitted, for the first time in my life, I don't know what to do. Jamal studied her. You built your career tearing people like me down. And now you want my help. She didn't look away. I don't expect your help. She hesitated. I just know I can't go back to who I was. Jamal leaned back, folding his arms. You think one press conference fixes everything? No, she said immediately. I don't. I don't expect people to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve it. Silence again. Then, Jamal smirked. You know, he said, when I left your show, I expected you to do what you always do. Spin the story. Blame the woke mob. Play the victim. She sighed. Believe me, my team begged me to do exactly that. But you didn't. No. Jamal exhaled. So what now? Meredith hesitated. I don't know, she admitted. But I do know one thing. Jamal raised an eyebrow. I need to burn it all down, she said. Everything. The network. The machine I helped build. It needs to come down. Jamal leaned in. You're talking about exposing them. She nodded. Jamal studied her carefully. For the first time, she wasn't the predator. She wasn't the master manipulator. She was just lost. And maybe, just maybe, she meant it. A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Well, he murmured. This just got interesting. Jamal leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. His sharp eyes studied Meredith, searching for cracks, for deception, for any hint that this was some elaborate ploy. But all he saw was a woman on the edge of something. Desperation? Redemption? A breakdown? He wasn't sure yet. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice calm but laced with skepticism. "You're telling me you want to expose your own network? The same people who made you rich? Who gave you power?" Meredith nodded slowly. Jamal exhaled. "That's cute. But why should I believe you?" Meredith held his gaze. "Because I have nothing left to lose." Jamal smirked. "You always have something to lose." She leaned in. "Not anymore." Silence hung between them. Jamal had been in enough high-stakes business meetings to recognize when someone was bluffing. But this? She wasn't bluffing. She was dead serious. And that made her dangerous. Hours earlier, while the world was still reeling from her press conference, Meredith had been locked in a brutal meeting with the executives of her network. They weren't happy. "What the hell was that, Meredith?" one of the board members shouted. "Do you realize what you've done?" Meredith sat at the long, glossy conference table, surrounded by furious men in expensive suits. She folded her hands. "I told the truth." Her boss, Richard Holloway, a silver-haired titan of the industry, narrowed his eyes. "That's not what we pay you to do." The room fell silent. Meredith felt her stomach twist. She had spent years in these rooms, obeying orders, playing the game, towing the company line. But now, she was done playing. "Let's cut the bull," she said, her voice steady. "We all know how this works. I say something outrageous. It goes viral. We get headlines. We get ratings. And the cycle repeats." A younger executive, Jacob, scoffed. "And it worked, didn't it?" Meredith's jaw clenched. "It worked at the expense of the truth." Richard leaned back in his chair. "Meredith, do you think we give a damn about truth? We sell fear. We sell division. That's the business we're in." His words hit her like a slap. She had always known it. Deep down, she had always known it. But hearing him say it out loud, it made her sick. Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, Meredith, we can fix this. Do a follow-up segment. Say you were caught up in the moment. Call Jamal an extremist. Blame the woke mob. Hell, we'll even throw in a sympathy piece for you." Meredith looked around the room. These men weren't just trying to salvage her career. They were trying to salvage their control. And she was done letting them. She shook her head. "No." Richard's eyes darkened. "Excuse me?" "I said no," she repeated, her voice firm. Jacob laughed. "Are you kidding? Do you have any idea what will happen if you don't clean this up?" "I do," she said. "And I don't care." Richard's face turned red. "Then you're done here." Meredith expected the words to sting. She expected to feel panic, regret, anything. But instead, she felt relief. She stood up, smoothing out her blazer. "Then I guess I'm done." She turned to leave, but Richard's voice stopped her. "Be careful, Meredith." His tone was low, cold. "You don't want to make enemies with people who know where all your skeletons are buried." She paused. Then, without another word, she walked out. And she never looked back. Now, sitting across from Jamal, Meredith felt the weight of what she had done. She had declared war on the machine that built her. And if she was going down, she was going to burn it to the ground first. Jamal studied her carefully. "You really think you can take them down?" Meredith exhaled. "Not alone." Jamal chuckled. "So that's why you're here. You want me to help you?" Meredith nodded. "You have power, resources, people who trust you." Jamal leaned back. "And what do I get out of this?" She met his gaze. "The truth. Everything." Jamal's expression didn't change, but Meredith could tell he was intrigued. "The network isn't just biased," she continued. "It's corrupt. They manipulate elections. They plant fake stories. They destroy people." Jamal arched an eyebrow. "And you have proof?" Meredith hesitated. Then, she reached into her bag and slid a USB drive across the table. Jamal glanced at it. "What's this?" She took a deep breath. "It's everything I have." Jamal picked it up, turning it over in his fingers. "If what's on here is real," he said, Then you just signed your own death warrant. Meredith swallowed hard. I know. Jamal exhaled. Then, he smiled. Well, well, he murmured. Let's burn it down. Jamal stared at the small USB drive in his hand, his mind racing. If Meredith was telling the truth, then what she had just handed him wasn't just a story. It was a weapon. And weapons like this? People killed for them. He looked up at her. You realize what happens next, right? Meredith exhaled. Yeah, you're not safe. I never was. Jamal leaned back, studying her. He wasn't sure if he admired her, or if she was the dumbest person alive. Maybe both. Then, he pocketed the USB. All right, he said. Let's blow it up. Later that night, Jamal sat alone in his penthouse office, staring at the drive. He knew better than to plug it into his personal computer. If what was on here was as bad as Meredith claimed, he needed serious protection before even opening it. His mind went back to her words. The network isn't just biased. It's corrupt. He had always known the game was rigged. That networks like Meredith's didn't just shape public opinion. They manufactured it. They didn't report the truth. They created it. But proof? Real, undeniable proof? That changed everything. His phone buzzed. Tyler's name lit up the screen. Yeah, Jamal answered. You need to see this, Tyler said, his voice tense. Turn on the news. Jamal grabbed the remote and switched to the first news channel he could find. What he saw made his stomach drop. Breaking news. Meredith Hale faces shocking allegations. A sleek news anchor sat behind a desk, her expression grim. Just hours after her explosive press conference, sources have come forward accusing former TV host Meredith Hale of financial misconduct and possible fraud. Jamal's grip on the remote tightened. They're coming for her, Tyler murmured over the phone. Jamal didn't respond. He already knew what this was. Retaliation. The network wasn't going to let Meredith just walk away. They were going to destroy her first. He flipped through channels. Every major news station was running the same hit piece. New reports suggest Hale may have used network funds for personal gain. Insiders claim Hale was aware of widespread corruption within her organization. Could this be the real reason she turned against her own network? Jamal exhaled sharply. They were flipping the script, making her look like the villain before she could expose the real story. And worst of all, it was working. Meanwhile, across town, Meredith sat in a darkened hotel room, watching the same broadcast. Her hands trembled as she clutched the remote. They were fast. Faster than she expected. But she should have known. Richard and his people had decades of practice at character assassination. And now, she was their target. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Hello? A cold, familiar voice sent a shiver down her spine. You should have listened, Richard Holloway said. Meredith's throat tightened. Go to hell. Richard chuckled. You think Jamal Carrington can save you? You think anyone can? She didn't answer. Richard's voice lowered. Darker. You don't understand what you've started, Meredith. This isn't just about you. This is about power. And people like us? We don't give up power. We erase threats. Her breath hitched. A soft rustling sound came through the phone, followed by a click. Then, Richard's voice again, almost amused. Maybe you should check your door. Her heart stopped. Slowly, she turned her head toward the hotel door. A shadow moved beneath the crack. Someone was outside. She dropped the phone and scrambled backward. The doorknob twisted. She grabbed a lamp from the bedside table, ready to swing, ready to fight. Then, bang, bang, bang. A fist slammed against the door. Meredith's breath came fast and shallow. Then, a voice. Meredith, it's me. Open up. Jamal. She nearly collapsed from relief. She rushed forward, unlocked the door, and yanked it open. Jamal stepped inside, his face tight with urgency. We need to go. Now. Meredith barely had time to process what was happening before he grabbed her arm and pulled her out into the hallway. What? How did you know where I was? She stammered. I had Tyler track your phone, Jamal said. Good thing, too. Because I think someone was about to pay you a visit. Meredith didn't argue. They ran. Down the hall, down the stairs, out into the cold night air. Jamal's car was waiting. The The second they got inside, he locked the doors and sped off. Meredith exhaled, trying to steady herself. They're trying to kill me. Jamal's jaw tightened. No, they're trying to scare you first. Make you run. Make you disappear. She swallowed hard. And if I don't? Jamal glanced at her. Then they kill you. The reality of it hit her like a freight train. This wasn't just about career suicide anymore. This was about survival. She turned to Jamal, her voice barely a whisper. What do we do now? Jamal's grip tightened on the steering wheel. We go to war. The city blurred past as Jamal's car sped through the night. Meredith sat in the passenger seat, her hands gripping her knees, her mind spinning. She had always been in control. She had always dictated the story. But now? Now, she was the story. Jamal's face was unreadable as he drove, his jaw clenched in thought. They came for you faster than I expected, he finally said. Meredith exhaled sharply. You expected this? I knew they wouldn't just let you walk away. But the fact that they've already put boots on the ground? He shook his head. That means you've got something big. Meredith's eyes flickered to the USB drive in his pocket. I don't even know everything that's on it, she admitted. But I know it's bad. The network. The people behind it. They're more powerful than you think. Jamal's lips twitched into a half smile. Trust me, I know exactly how powerful they are. Meredith turned to him. Then why are you helping me? Jamal didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the road, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel. Finally, he said, because for years, I watched people like you shape the narrative. People like me? We were statistics. We were the problem. We were the excuse. She swallowed hard. And now? Now, I have a chance to end that machine, he said. For good. Meredith hesitated. What if we lose? She whispered. Jamal smirked. We're already dead if we don't try. An hour later, they pulled up to a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't some dingy, abandoned lot. It was secure, a sleek, high-tech facility that screamed power. Jamal parked the car and stepped out. Let's go. Meredith hesitated. Where are we? My war room, he said simply. She followed him inside, and as the heavy steel doors locked behind them, she realized. She had officially crossed the line. There was no turning back now. Inside, a team was already waiting. Tyler, Jamal's assistant, was in front of several monitors, tapping away furiously. Next to him was a hacker, a wiry young woman with purple hair and a knowing smirk. You weren't kidding, the hacker said, looking at Meredith. She really jumped ship. Meredith crossed her arms. And you are? The woman grinned. Name's Lex. I make problems disappear and create new ones when necessary. Meredith shot a glance at Jamal. You have a hacker? Jamal smirked. I have everything. Lex turned back to her screen. I've already started digging into your financial scandal. It's completely fabricated. Classic misdirection. Meredith exhaled. I figured as much. They moved fast, Tyler added. Too fast. They were ready for you to flip. Which means they've been watching me for a while, Meredith finished. Jamal sat down, pulling the USB drive from his pocket. All right, he said. Let's see what we're dealing with. Lex took the drive, plugged it into an isolated system, and started running decryption protocols. As files loaded onto the screen, the room went silent. Then, Tyler let out a low whistle. Damn, he muttered. Meredith stepped closer. What is it? Lex pointed at the screen. Emails, bank transfers, internal memos, evidence, and not just any evidence. Proof that the network had been directly involved in rigging political narratives, funding smear campaigns, and even bribing law enforcement officials. It was worse than Meredith had imagined. This is a kill shot, Lex said, her voice quieter now. Jamal leaned forward. Can we verify it? Lex nodded. Give me a few hours. But from what I see, this is the real deal. Meredith swallowed hard. Her entire world was in that drive, and she had just handed it over to a man she once saw as the enemy. Jamal turned to her. Now do you understand why they want you gone? Meredith nodded. They won't stop, she whispered. Not until I'm either discredited or dead. Jamal smirked. Then we need to move first. 3 hours later, they had a plan. Lex had verified several key documents from the drive. The corruption went deep, deeper than even Meredith realized. Richard Holloway is just a puppet, Lex explained. The real power? It's in the shadows. People who don't have their names in the news. People who never step in front of a camera. Jamal folded his arms. Then let's drag them into the light. Meredith hesitated. How? Jamal's eyes darkened. We're going to take everything from them. Meredith frowned. You mean, leak the files? No, Jamal said. That's too easy. We do that, they spin it. Say it's a hoax. Fake news. They bury it under noise. Tyler nodded. We need something bigger. Undeniable. Jamal looked at Meredith. You were one of their biggest assets, he said. Now, you're their biggest threat. Meredith exhaled. So you want to use me? I want you to set the trap. She hesitated. Jamal leaned in. Richard thinks he's won. He thinks you're weak. So let's let him think that. Meredith's pulse quickened. You want me to go back? Jamal nodded. You go back to the network, he said. Pretend you regret everything. Pretend you want to make things right. And while I'm in there, she asked. Jamal smirked. You bring them down from the inside. The next day, the entire country woke up to shocking news. Meredith Hale, after days of controversy, had agreed to sit down for a tell-all interview with her former network. The headlines were everywhere. Meredith Hale to break her silence. Will she apologize? Exclusive interview scheduled. Hale faces the nation. The end of the controversy? And inside a cold, dark office, Richard Holloway smirked as he read the news. She finally came to her senses, he muttered, swirling his drink. But what Richard didn't know, he was walking straight into the biggest trap of his life. Because Meredith wasn't coming back to apologize. She was coming back to destroy him. The world was watching. For the past week, Meredith Hale had been the center of controversy, the subject of endless debates, theories, and speculation. But now, she was returning to the very network she had walked away from. The exclusive primetime interview was scheduled for 8 p.m. sharp. Millions of Americans tuned in, expecting to see a broken woman, a humbled former media giant begging for forgiveness. But what they didn't know, Meredith Hale was about to deliver the most explosive betrayal in television history. Backstage, inside the network's gleaming New York studio, Meredith sat in a dressing room, staring at her own reflection. She looked calm, too calm. Inside, her heart was pounding. She knew the stakes. This wasn't just about saving her career. This was about survival. A knock at the door. She inhaled sharply. Come in. The door opened, and Richard Holloway stepped inside. The man who had built her. The man who had tried to destroy her. Richard smirked. You finally came to your senses. Meredith didn't respond. She just studied him. The arrogance. The control. The power. But tonight, she was taking that power away. I'm glad you're here, Richard continued, stepping closer. The network is ready to welcome you back. We'll clean up your image, help you repair what you lost. Meredith tilted her head. So I was wrong? Richard's smirk widened. Of course you were. She nodded slowly. And if I had refused to come back? His smile didn't fade. Then we would have buried you. Meredith's stomach turned, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she simply smiled back. Well, she said, standing up, then I guess it's a good thing I came back. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. Welcome home, Meredith. Enjoy it while it lasts, she thought. Because in exactly 1 hour, his empire was going to crumble. At 7:59 p.m., America held its breath. The Meredith Hale redemption interview was about to begin. Inside the studio, bright lights glowed. Cameras were rolling. Every major news outlet was watching, waiting. Richard sat across from Meredith, his posture relaxed, confident. He thought he had one. The interview began. For the first 10 minutes, Meredith played her part perfectly. She looked remorseful. She spoke softly. She admitted her mistakes. She let Richard lead the conversation, let him guide her toward the apology America expected. Richard smiled, sensing victory. But then, at the 11-minute mark, everything changed. Meredith's expression hardened. She straightened in her chair. And then, she said 5 words that shook the world. "This entire network is corrupt." Silence. The audience gasped. Richard's smile vanished. "Excuse me," he said, trying to mask his shock. Meredith turned to the cameras, her voice steady. "For years, I sat in this chair and lied to you. I pushed fear. I manipulated facts. I spread division. And I did it because I was told to." Richard's eyes darkened. "Meredith, stop." She didn't. She turned to the producers in the control room, where millions of people were watching behind the scenes. "I know you want to cut the feed," she said, "but I wouldn't do that if I were you." Richard clenched his jaw. "You don't control this network." Meredith smiled. "No," she said, "but he does." The screen behind her lit up, and suddenly, Jamal Carrington's face appeared live on air. And he had the files. The USB drive. The evidence. Jamal leaned forward in his chair, his voice calm, his eyes cold. "Good evening, America," he said. "Let's talk about the truth." Richard froze. Producers in the control room panicked. Phones rang. Alarms blared. This wasn't just a leak. This was an ambush. Jamal continued, his face filling the screen. "Richard Holloway and this network have spent decades manipulating public opinion, controlling elections, and silencing the truth. But tonight, the truth comes out." With a click, the screen flashed. Emails, documents, bank records, all of it, broadcasted live on national television. Viewers across the country sat in shock as secrets spilled out, secrets that couldn't be denied. Richard's hands trembled. This wasn't just career-ending. This was criminal. "You have no idea what you've done," Richard hissed at Meredith. She turned to him, her eyes cold. "No, Richard," she said. "I know exactly what I've done." The fallout was instant. Social media erupted. News stations scrambled. Richard Holloway, the king of conservative media, was exposed as a fraud, a manipulator, a criminal. And the network? Finished. Stock prices plummeted. Sponsors pulled out. Investigations were launched. By morning, Richard Holloway had been removed from his own company. Arrest warrants were issued. And Meredith Hale? For the first time in her life, she was finally free. 1 week later, in a quiet rooftop lounge overlooking the city, Meredith sat across from Jamal, sipping a glass of wine. "You did it," Jamal said. Meredith smirked. "We did it." Jamal studied her. "So what's next for Meredith Hale?" She exhaled, looking out at the city. "For the first time in my life," she admitted, "I don't know." Jamal raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said. She smiled. And for the first time in a long, long time, she meant it. The world was on fire. Richard Holloway's empire had collapsed overnight. Headlines screamed betrayal. Investigations. Lawsuits. Arrests. Disgraced media mogul Richard Holloway indicted for corruption. Former TV host Meredith Hale destroys her own network. America reacts. Jamal Carrington unleashes the truth. The biggest media scandal of the decade. The network's executives were fleeing, throwing out weak denials as law enforcement tore through their files. Stock prices had plummeted to nearly nothing. And Richard? He had vanished. No one had seen him since the night of the interview. The FBI had raided his penthouse, but it was empty. His bank accounts? Drained. He had gone underground. And that meant one thing. He wasn't done yet. Jamal knew it was coming. The retaliation. The truth was out, but men like Richard didn't just disappear. They came back. Stronger. Darker. More ruthless. So when Jamal's phone rang that morning, he already knew. He exhaled before answering. "Talk to me." Lex's voice was sharp. "We have a problem." Jamal sat up. "What kind of problem?" "Richard's not just hiding. He's moving." Jamal's grip tightened on the phone. "Explain." Lex tapped furiously at her keyboard. Before he vanished, he transferred over $50 million into offshore accounts. That money isn't just for running. He's planning something. Jamal's stomach twisted. "What else?" Lex hesitated. "You're not gonna like this. Just say it." Lex inhaled. "There's been a hit placed on Meredith." Silence. Jamal's blood ran cold. Lex continued. It's not just rumors. I've been picking up chatter on dark web forums. People are being hired. This isn't a scare tactic anymore. They want her dead. Jamal didn't hesitate. Where is she now? Lex pulled up a live feed. She's staying at a safe house in the Hamptons. She's got some security, but not enough, Jamal finished. Not even close. He was already moving, grabbing his keys, his mind racing. Get Tyler, he ordered. We're going to get her out. Meredith sat on the porch of the secluded safe house, staring at the ocean waves. She should have been relieved. She had won. The truth was out. The world knew. But the victory felt hollow, because Richard was still out there. And that meant this wasn't over. A cold breeze swept across the porch. She pulled her jacket tighter and exhaled. Then, her phone buzzed. She looked down. Unknown number. Her heart stopped. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she answered. She didn't speak. At first, there was silence. Then, a voice. Richard's voice. Did you really think you could get away with it, Meredith? Her breath caught in her throat. She gripped the phone tighter. You're finished, Richard. You have nothing left. Richard chuckled. Do I? Meredith's pulse pounded. Then, Richard's voice dropped, smooth and menacing. Let's play a game. Meredith swallowed. What game? I'm going to count to 3. She froze. Her stomach twisted. 1. Her eyes darted around the porch. 2. The waves crashed harder against the shore. Her gut screamed at her. Something was wrong. Then, 3. And gunshots shattered the night. A bullet tore through the wooden railing, splinters exploding everywhere. Meredith dove to the ground, her breath coming in fast, panicked gasps. Her heart slammed against her ribs. They found me. Oh my God, they found me. More shots rang out, shattering glass, ripping through furniture inside the house. Meredith crawled across the porch, adrenaline surging through her veins. She had no weapon, no way to fight back. She was trapped. Then, screeching tires, headlights flashing, and a familiar voice shouting, Meredith, get in the car. Jamal. She didn't think. She ran. Bullets whizzed past her, slamming into the ground inches away. Jamal threw open the passenger door. She dove inside just as he hit the gas. The car spun out, gravel kicking up as he tore away from the safe house. Meredith was shaking, trying to catch her breath. Jamal's hands were tight on the wheel, his jaw clenched. What the hell was that? She gasped. Jamal's voice was ice cold. That, he said, was Richard declaring war. The car raced down the dark coastal highway. Meredith turned to Jamal. How did you know? Jamal's grip on the wheel tightened. They put a hit on you, he said. Lex picked up the chatter. I wasn't going to wait for them to find you. Meredith's hands trembled. They were already there. Jamal exhaled sharply. I know. Silence. The weight of it all hit her at once. She wasn't just a target now. She was a walking death sentence. Richard wanted her gone. And after tonight, he wasn't going to stop. She turned to Jamal, her voice barely a whisper. What do we do now? Jamal's eyes stayed fixed on the road. We stop running, he said. Meredith frowned. What does that mean? Jamal exhaled. It means we hunt him first. That night, Richard Holloway sat in a luxury safe house, sipping a glass of whiskey. He had expected Meredith to be dead by now, but instead, she was still breathing. He clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath his skin. Then, his phone rang. He answered without thinking. A voice spoke on the other end. Calm, cold. Jamal Carrington. Richard stiffened. You have some nerve calling me. Jamal chuckled. I just wanted you to know something, Richard. Silence. Then, Jamal's voice dropped. You missed your shot. Richard's grip tightened on the phone. You think this is over? Jamal's voice was a whisper now. I think it's just beginning. And then, he hung up. Richard stared at the phone. His pulse was pounding. For the first time since this started, he was the one being hunted. The game had changed. Richard Holloway was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted, and he knew it. Sitting in the dimly lit safe house, he swirled the whiskey in his glass, his mind racing. Jamal Carrington had just declared war. For years, Richard had been the one pulling the strings. controlling the news, controlling the narrative. But now, he was the story. His empire had crumbled overnight. His face was plastered across the news as the villain. The FBI had frozen his known assets. His former allies were deserting him like rats on a sinking ship, and Meredith Hale, the woman he had created, had destroyed him. But she had made a mistake. She had left him alive. And as long as he was breathing, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jamal didn't sleep that night. He sat in a secure location, a private bunker beneath one of his Manhattan properties, going over every shred of evidence they had against Richard. Lex and Tyler were in the next room, running surveillance, tracking every possible lead. Meredith sat across from him, her arms crossed, exhaustion written all over her face. She hadn't said much since the attack. Jamal knew why. She had nearly died. And after years of being the one in control, she was now realizing just how dangerous this game really was. This is bigger than just Richard, Jamal finally said, breaking the silence. Meredith looked up. What do you mean? Jamal leaned forward. Richard is powerful, but he's not the mastermind. The people funding him? The people who built the network? They're still out there. Meredith swallowed. Then taking him down isn't enough. Jamal nodded. We need to cut the head off the snake. Lex walked in, holding a tablet. You guys are gonna love this, she said, smirking. We found Richard. Jamal raised an eyebrow. Where? Lex tapped the screen. He's in a high-end safe house. Outside the city. Guarded, but not impenetrable. Jamal exhaled. He's still close. Because he's planning something, Meredith muttered. Lex nodded. Exactly. Tyler entered, holding up a burner phone. And we also got this. Jamal took the phone. What is it? Tyler's face was grim. Richard just wired another $10 million to a private security firm. Meredith's blood ran cold. That's a kill order. Jamal's grip on the phone tightened. They're not just after you anymore, Tyler said. They're coming for all of us. Richard's safe house was quiet. Too quiet. Sitting in his private study, he checked his phone. The wire transfer had gone through. The best of the best were on their way. No more mistakes. No more waiting. By sunrise, Jamal Carrington and Meredith Hale would be dead. Or so he thought. Because what Richard didn't know, what he couldn't possibly suspect, was that the hunters were already inside the house. Jamal moved like a shadow, silent as he stepped through the dark corridors, his pulse steady. Meredith followed just behind him, a pistol in her hands. She wasn't a trained operative. She wasn't a fighter. But tonight, she had become one. Lex's voice crackled in their earpieces. Security's light. Richard doesn't think anyone would dare come for him. Jamal smirked. He thought wrong. They moved deeper into the house. Tyler's voice came through. You've got 2 guards at the end of the hallway. Jamal nodded, signaling to Meredith. She swallowed hard. You sure about this? Jamal didn't hesitate. You want to survive? She nodded. Then let's finish this. Inside the study, Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the whiskey glass in his hand. A movement in the shadows caught his attention. His blood ran cold. Then, the lights went out. Richard's heart pounded. He reached for the pistol on his desk, but a voice stopped him cold. Don't bother. The voice was calm, cold. Jamal. Richard turned, and sure enough, he was there. Standing in the darkness, his silhouette outlined against the dim moonlight. Meredith stood beside him, her hands steady. Richard forced a smirk. Well. Jamal stepped forward. It's over. Richard chuckled. You think you've won? Jamal didn't respond. He just pulled out a small recorder and pressed play. Richard's own voice filled the room. We sell fear. We sell division. That's the business we're in. Richard's smirk vanished. Jamal tilted his head. Sound familiar? Richard clenched his jaw. You son of a... Meredith cut him off. You lost, Richard. Richard's hands tightened into fists. You think taking me down will change anything? The people who put me here, the real power, they'll just replace me. You can't fight them. They'll crush you. Jamal stared at him for a long moment. Then, he smiled. We're not taking you down, Richard, he said. We're taking all of them down. And then, Meredith stepped forward and placed a USB drive on Richard's desk. Richard frowned. What is this? Meredith smirked. A gift. Richard picked it up hesitantly. Jamal's eyes darkened. Every single dirty secret you have, he said. Every offshore account. Every bribe. Every corrupt deal. Richard's face drained of color. Jamal leaned in. You have two choices, he said. Turn yourself in. Or let the world see everything. Richard stared at the USB. He knew. He had lost. For the first time in his life, Richard Holloway was powerless. And as he looked up at Jamal and Meredith, he saw it in their eyes. This wasn't revenge. This was justice. Richard exhaled sharply. Then, slowly, he reached for his phone and dialed the FBI. 1 hour later, as Richard Holloway was placed in handcuffs and led away, Jamal and Meredith stood outside, watching. Meredith turned to him. It's done. Jamal exhaled. Almost. Meredith frowned. What do you mean? Jamal's eyes darkened. There are still others. And as the sun rose over the city, they both knew. This fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The world was watching again. Richard Holloway, the once untouchable king of conservative media, was now a criminal in handcuffs. Cameras flashed. Reporters screamed questions. But Richard said nothing. He simply stared ahead, his face a mask of cold fury as FBI agents escorted him into a waiting black SUV. Jamal and Meredith watched from a rooftop across the street. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't, because they both knew the truth. Richard was never the real power. He was just a piece on the board. And now? Now, the people who really ran the machine, the ones who funded Richard, the ones who owned the networks, the politicians, the corporations, they were coming. That night, Jamal sat in his penthouse office, staring at his phone. News of Richard's arrest was everywhere. Holloway indicted. Corruption charges shake media industry. Ex-network boss to testify before Congress. Who else will fall? Meredith Hale and Jamal Carrington. The team that took down a media giant. Jamal wasn't interested in the headlines. He was interested in what came next. His phone buzzed. Lex's voice came through. You need to see this. Jamal leaned forward. What is it? I traced Richard's money, Lex said. The $50 million he wired before disappearing? It wasn't just for security. Jamal's pulse quickened. Where did it go? Lex hesitated. Then, to a secret fund linked to multiple U.S. senators, high-ranking judges, and foreign investors. Jamal exhaled sharply. Meredith, sitting across from him, frowned. Meaning? Jamal met her eyes. Meaning Richard wasn't just protecting himself, he said. He was protecting all of them. Meredith's stomach dropped. So, what happens now? Jamal's voice was calm. Steady. Deadly. We go higher. Meanwhile, in an undisclosed private estate, a group of powerful men sat in silence. Men who never appeared on TV. Men whose names were never in the news. They were the real owners of Richard's network. The true architects of media manipulation, of government influence, of public deception. Richard's arrest had shaken them. But they weren't worried. Not yet. One of them, an older man with a sharp gaze, spoke first. Carrington and Hale need to be dealt with. Another man, younger, tapped his fingers on the table. The media isn't enough anymore. We need a permanent solution. A silence fell over the room. Then, a simple nod. And just like that, a new order was given. Jamal and Meredith wouldn't survive the week. Back in New York, Jamal's instincts kicked in. Something felt off. He didn't trust silence. Not from them. So he moved first. By midnight, he and Meredith were in a secure underground location, Lex and Tyler running surveillance. Their money is connected to everything, Lex explained, pointing at the screen. Media, banks, even the justice system. Meredith crossed her arms. So what do we do? Jamal's voice was calm, calculated. We hit them where it hurts. Lex grinned. Their money. Jamal nodded. We take it all. The next morning, across the world, something unprecedented happened. Accounts tied to media executives, politicians, and powerful elites were wiped out. Offshore accounts? Gone. Shell corporations? Exposed. Millions vanished. Jamal's team had pulled off the impossible. They had turned the weapons of the richest and most powerful men on the planet against them. And now, those men had nothing left to hide behind. But Jamal knew what came next. Because men with nothing left to lose, they become the most dangerous enemies of all. That night, as Meredith sat in a quiet safe house, she felt it. The unease. The storm building. She turned to Jamal. "You feel that?" Jamal nodded. "Yeah, they're coming." Jamal exhaled. "I know." And as the city lights flickered outside, they both knew. The war wasn't over. It was about to explode. The war had begun. Jamal and Meredith weren't just targets anymore. They were public enemy number one. And their enemies? They weren't just media moguls or corrupt businessmen. They were the untouchables. Senators, judges, CEOs, foreign billionaires. Men who had shaped the world from the shadows for decades. Men who didn't lose. And now, they were coming for blood. Jamal knew the hit would come fast. They had humiliated Richard Holloway. They had crippled the network. And worst of all, they had cut off the money. The one thing these people lived for. That was a declaration of war. So he moved first. "Tyler, what do we have?" Jamal asked, pacing the underground bunker. Tyler's fingers flew over the keyboard. "Surveillance chatter is blowing up. They know what we did. And they're not going to try to smear you anymore. They're going straight to elimination." Meredith swallowed hard. "Meaning?" Lex turned from her screen. "Meaning there's a kill order on both of you." Meredith felt a chill run down her spine. Jamal exhaled sharply. "Who's coming?" Lex's eyes darkened. "A private mercenary group. Ex-military. No ties. No paper trail." Meredith's heart pounded. "They hired a kill squad?" Jamal nodded. "They don't play games." Tyler looked up. "We have less than 24 hours before they move." Meredith clenched her jaw. "So what's the plan?" Jamal met her eyes. "We turn the hunters into the hunted." At 2 a.m., the safe house was dark, quiet. A luxury mansion in the Hamptons, meant to be untraceable. But the kill team found it anyway. 6 men. Silent. Armed. Ruthless. They moved like ghosts, slipping through the perimeter undetected. Inside, the house was empty. Too empty. The lead assassin signaled his team. "Something's wrong." Then, boom. The first explosion ripped through the back wall. Then, gunfire. The mercenaries spun, weapons raised. But they weren't alone anymore. Jamal and his men descended like a storm. Silencers. Precision. Lethal force. In 10 seconds, 4 of the mercenaries were down. The last 2 tried to run. But Jamal stepped out of the shadows, gun in hand. "Leaving so soon?" he asked. The lead assassin hesitated. This wasn't supposed to happen." Jamal smirked. "Yeah? Well, I don't play by your rules." A single gunshot echoed in the night. And just like that, the hit squad was gone. Inside the bunker, Meredith was shaking. She had seen violence before. But this was a different world. Jamal sat across from her, calm as ever. "You good?" She exhaled. "That depends. Are we alive?" Jamal chuckled. "For now." Meredith rubbed her temples. "We just took out their kill team. What do you think they're gonna do next?" Jamal's smile faded. "They're gonna stop hiding." And Jamal was right. By sunrise, everything changed. The world woke up to chaos. Breaking news. Explosive headlines. Billionaire Jamal Carrington under investigation. Possible terror links? Meredith Hale accused of leaking classified information. FBI launches probe. Government to freeze Carrington's assets amid growing controversy. The elites weren't playing defense anymore. They were going for the kill shot. Jamal sat in front of the screens, watching as his entire empire collapsed in real time. Bank accounts? Frozen. Business deals? Destroyed. Reputation? Torn apart. They had stripped him of everything in a matter of hours. Meredith's voice was tight. "They're taking you down." Jamal nodded. "They're trying." Lex turned from her screen. "It's not just you, Jamal." She pointed at the monitor. Meredith's face was all over the news. "FBI just issued a warrant for your arrest." Meredith's breath caught. "What?" Lex nodded grimly. "They're making you the traitor." saying you leaked state secrets. Meredith's hands trembled. This wasn't just a media hit job anymore. This was government level. Jamal exhaled. They're done playing. Meredith swallowed. So what do we do? Jamal's eyes hardened. We hit back. That night, in a high-rise office overlooking Washington, D.C., a group of powerful men gathered. They were the ones who truly controlled everything. And they were angry. Richard Holloway had been a problem. But Jamal and Meredith? They were a threat. One of the men, a senator with deep connections, leaned forward. We end them. Permanently. Another man nodded. I know just the way to do it. He slid a folder across the table. Inside, a presidential executive order. One signature. And Jamal and Meredith would be labeled domestic terrorists, which meant they could be killed on sight. Jamal and Meredith didn't know it yet. But in 24 hours, they were going to be the most wanted people in the country. And this time, there would be no safe place left to hide. The war had reached its final stage. Jamal and Meredith weren't just targets anymore. They were hunted fugitives. The full weight of the U.S. government was now against them. A presidential executive order had declared them domestic terrorists. Their faces were on every screen, their names whispered in fear and outrage. News anchors labeled them radicals, criminals, threats to national security. Their bank accounts were gone. Their safe houses were compromised. And now, they had 24 hours before the kill teams found them. Jamal stood in the underground bunker, staring at the massive screen in front of him. Live feeds, news reports, surveillance intercepts. Everything pointed to one undeniable fact. This was the endgame. Lex, her fingers flying over the keyboard, cursed under her breath. They're moving too fast. This isn't just a manhunt. This is eradication. Tyler, arms crossed, exhaled. We need a way out. Fast. Meredith sat against the wall, rubbing her temples. They took everything. Jamal's voice was calm, steady, cold. Not everything. Lex frowned. What do you mean? Jamal turned to them. They think they control the system. The government. The media. The banks. The courts. Meredith looked up. And Jamal smirked. But I own the truth. At 6 a.m., the world woke up to something they never expected. Not another news hit piece. Not another government briefing. Instead, Jamal Carrington broadcasted live to the entire world. The signal was untraceable. Every social media platform, every hacked news channel, Jamal's face appeared, his voice clear, unwavering. This is the truth they don't want you to hear. Behind him, documents flashed across the screen, bank records of corrupt politicians, emails exposing government-funded disinformation, leaked intelligence reports proving the elite controlled the media. Then, the final blow, the executive order itself. The proof that the government had fabricated terrorist charges against Jamal and Meredith to silence them forever. The world exploded. Social media erupted in chaos. Protests ignited in major cities. The government's lies unraveled in real time. And those who had hunted Jamal and Meredith, they were now running for cover. Inside the White House, the president watched in stunned silence. His advisors were shouting over each other, trying to figure out how the hell this had happened. This is treason. One of them yelled. Another whispered, Sir. It's over. The world knew. The corruption was exposed. The president's power was crumbling before his eyes. And then, his phone rang. A private number. He hesitated, then answered. A familiar voice spoke. Jamal Carrington. Game over. The line went dead. And for the first time, the most powerful man in the world felt powerless. Across the country, chaos erupted. The FBI was forced to retract the charges against Jamal and Meredith. Richard Holloway, still in federal custody, had no allies left to save him. Politicians resigned. Networks collapsed. The machine that had controlled America for decades, it was finally falling apart. 2 days later, Jamal and Meredith stood on a quiet rooftop, watching the sunrise. They had won, but at a cost. They could never go back to normal. They had burned too many bridges, made too many enemies. But they had also changed the world. Meredith exhaled. So what happens now? Jamal smirked. Now. He turned to her. We build something better. Meredith chuckled. A billionaire and a former TV villain, changing the world together? Jamal shrugged. Stranger things have happened. She smiled. And as the sun rose, for the first time in their lives, they were finally free.